Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and good night, depending on when you are in the world watching this. I hope that you're all well. I had the experience recently of doing an interview with Christian Premier Radio on the topic of Christian nationalism, and needless to say, the interview wasn't that extensively used. It was chopped up and edited, and Christian Premier Radio was essentially trying to establish the idea that Christian nationalism is irksome and not something that Christians should get involved with. And myself and Tim Dieppe, who's about to join me, we're going to do a response to the radio program. But when it was finally broadcast, there was like no bones, no meat. It was a bit flannelly and thin. So instead, we decided to make a response to Danny Webster of the Evangelical Alliance, who published an article called "What's Wrong with Christian Nationalism?" and was published by Christian Premier Radio. So today we're going to be talking about that. So before I bring on my esteemed guest, Tim Dieppe of Christian Concern, I just want to say, if you are enjoying or you value what we're bringing you to you on these live streams, then do a couple of things for me. One, please subscribe. Two, please share the videos. And four, if you're able, without putting yourself under any financial burden, please do support the work that I do. All the necessary links are in the description box. And finally, go and check out the back catalogue. I have a massive back catalogue of live streams and talks, which I think you will find edifying and good. So without further ado, let me bring on my co-host today, Tim Dieppe. How you doing, Tim?
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and good night.
Yeah. Indeed, to you as well.
Yeah.
So how are you? How's life?
I'm good, thank you. I'm very good. Yeah.
Good. Good. Did you go on the? Did you go or did you watch any of the United Kingdom march that just happened with Tommy Robinson?
I watched some of it. Yep. I particularly liked the Nigerian bishop.
Yeah.
And the way Tommy introduced him and what he had to say. There were clearly some strong Christian messages in the mix of what was said there, and I was encouraged by that and pleased to see it. And I think there is a kind of nostalgic, at least sort of longing for a return to Christianity in this nation, which means that people are very open to the gospel there.
Yeah. Thanks be to God.
That's encouraging to see, I think. Yeah.
Brilliant. Now, I should just let you know, Tim, sometimes my internet does kick me out of my own live streams. So there is the possibility that you might be going solo. In which case, if that happens, you just keep talking until I manage to get back in. I will get back in as soon as I can.
Same to you if I get kicked off, all right?
Right, yeah, of course. If we both get kicked off, that's the end of the live stream, folks. So, yeah, unfortunately, they've told me that my internet can never be repaired. So I'm stuck with this problem until I move out of where I'm living. So before we begin, shall we begin with a prayer? I believe that you've chosen the classic one for all political talk. So if you just want to read a psalm all the way through as our opening prayer.
All right. Well, I thought we'd read Psalm 2 because it's about nations. And since we're talking about nations, let's read that psalm. So Psalm 2, I'm doing the NIV. Why do the nations conspire and all the peoples plot in vain? The kings of the earth rise up and the rulers band together against the Lord and against his anointed, saying, let us break their chains and throw off their shackles. The one enthroned in heaven laughs. The Lord scoffs at them. He rebukes them in anger and terrifies them in his wrath, saying, I have installed my king on Zion, my holy mountain. I will proclaim the Lord's decree. He said to me, you are my son. Today I have become your father. Ask me, and I will make the nations your inheritance, the ends of the earth your possession. You will break them with a rod of iron. You will dash them to pieces like pottery. Therefore, you kings, be wise. Be warned, you rulers of the earth. Serve the Lord with fear and celebrate his rule with trembling. Kiss the Son, or he will be angry, and your way will lead you to destruction. For his wrath can flare up in a moment. Blessed are all who take refuge in him.
This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. So one of the funniest things about the interview that I had was an incidental comment that was made by the interviewer, which gave away the fact that Christian Premier Radio does not hold to a Christian position on abortion, doesn't hold to a Christian position on sexual relationships or on the definition of marriage or even on the concepts of gender. They were ambivalent.
On gender?
On gender, yeah. They were ambivalent to take a position, it seemed to me.
I mean, I should be shocked by all of those. I'm shocked by gender. So you've told me about the abortion and other things before, but the gender one is another one.
Well, I was shocked and surprised, and it's ironic that it almost moves Christian Premier Radio from being.
What did they say? They said what Christians can take different views on.
Well, I commented on it when they were asking me about Christian nationalism. They asked me, what does Christian nationalism stand for? And I started giving out a list in which I mentioned abortion and LGBTQ silent P politics. And they turned around and said, well, of course, Christians have different positions on these things. And it's like, Christians might have different positions, but the Bible really has only got one. So, so I found that a bit shocking.
I'm sorry, you can't be a Christian and be pro-abortion. You just can't. It's not consistent, right? You can't be a Christian and be pro-sexual immorality. You can't be a Christian and be pro the idea that people are born in the wrong body. It's just that you're not a Christian if you believe those things.
Absolutely. It definitely throws into question. It draws out two things. One, how much Christian Premier Radio needs Christian nationalism. And two, the irony that they reject and are suspicious of expressions of cultural Christianity when they themselves have been reduced to being an institution of cultural Christianity by a lack of their own faithfulness to apostolic teaching.
Well, it seems like I wouldn't call it cultural Christianity, but I'd call it Christianity in name only.
You're harsher than me. You're harsher than me. So the way that we're going to do this, for those that don't know, which is everybody except Tim, is that each of us are going to give our individual response to Danny Webster's article, What's Wrong with Christian Nationalism? And we're going to do it in about 25 minutes, and then we're going to respond to one another's comments and talk at length, and then any time left, if there's a decent enough audience that's engaged with the topic, we'll take questions, and if there isn't, you guys will just chat amongst yourselves as you always do, and I will just keep talking with Tim about Christian nationalism. But I do want to say from the outset, Danny Webster, obviously we're talking about you, and you're talking about your article. So anyone that I talk about on this channel has an automatic right to reply. And so you would be welcome, if you wanted to come on and reply to both me and Tim. And I would try to get Tim onto that broadcast as well, so that you can reply to Tim and me directly. But if you don't want to, that's fine. The offer is there. I think that's only fair. So would you like to go first, or shall I go first?
I'm happy to go first.
Yep, go on then.
Obviously people are interested in Christian nationalism again, Bob, in a way that they haven't been interested. There's not been a topic of conversation really, pretty much my whole life until the last few years. And I think the reason people are interested in it is because we're realizing that we've lost our identity as a Christian nation. And we're thinking, well, what did it mean to be a Christian nation, and what do we want, and how do we lose it, and what kind of nation are we? And multiculturalism has come in, but clearly that's wrong. So then what do we want? And people are thinking, well, maybe we do want to be a Christian nation. Actually, that's what we were, and we should try and get back to that again. And so this is what people are saying is Christian nationalism, and how people think of Christian nationalism really. And so, obviously the whole Tommy Robinson phenomenon and all of those marches and things are part of this, and part of what's provoked this. And the big march last September and another one this last Saturday are getting people talking about this. And there's been lots of reaction to that, more to the one in September, I think, than the one this Saturday, partly because it was the first one, partly because it was such a big one. There's a lot of curiosity about that one. The second one, a bit less curiosity, I feel, about it. But it provoked a lot of conversation. Gosh, these people are using Christian symbols and carrying crosses, and there's a bishop there, and there are some other, obviously, Christian speakers there, and so on. And also, Tommy organised a carol service, which I went to in December, and so that's very explicitly Christian. The gospel was preached multiple times at that carol service by various people. And so there's something Christian going on here, but also carrying flags and things. So, what do they want? What do they mean? How should Christians respond to it? What should Christians think about it? And the point for me is that Christians haven't really thought about this for the last generation or two or three, right? They've just thought we're a Christian nation. I think, when in my generation, there were people at school who, are you a Christian? They say, yes, because I'm British. Yes, because I'm English. The idea, obviously, because I grew up in a Christian nation kind of thing. But people don't say that now. They wouldn't say that now, because we've lost that completely. We can debate whether that's a good thing or a bad thing. So now we're thinking, what is Christian nationalism, and what was it, and what is it, and do we want it? And people are scared of this word nationalism for good reasons. And so then, the whoever approached who, I don't know. Did Premier approach the EA, or did the EA approach Premier and say, we want to write something about this? And it was a cover story on the Premier Christianity magazine in February. What's Wrong with Christian Nationalism by Danny Webster, who works for the Evangelical Alliance, the EA. It's a long, in-depth article for Premier Christian magazine, and there's some good points in it. But there's some discussion about all that context that I've just said, not all the words I've said, but some of that kind of stuff. And Danny rightly says a lot depends how you define it, and he's quite right about that. And that's where a lot of the dispute turns on this. Like, if you define it one way, then you're going to say it's wrong. If you define it another way, you're going to say maybe it's not so bad after all. Part of what they did in preparation for this article, or for the subject generally, is a survey, and they surveyed 900 UK evangelicals late last year, and 94% said Christians have a God-given responsibility to influence all areas of society. Now, that I find that encouraging, because that's exactly what we say at Christian Concern. We're trying to. I think our strapline is, we want to see the gospel influence every area of society. And I always sort of joke that when we've done that, we'll retire, kind of thing. Because that's our vision, right? We want to see Christianity influencing every area of society, not just individual salvation, but the whole of culture, the whole of law, the whole of business, finance, medicine, every single area. Obviously that includes abortion when I mention medicine and so on. And it includes all of these things, sexual ethics, etc. We want to influence the whole of society. So that's really encouraging. 94% of people who did this survey said Christians have a God-given responsibility to influence all areas of society. And then 77% agree that Christianity has deeply shaped the UK's political culture. I mean, who would disagree with that? But anyway, it's a big majority. And And 61% said that the UK is a Christian country and this should be reflected in its laws. Again, that's a clear majority of Christians, 61%. So there we go. And then he says the lowest support was saying Christianity should have a preferential position in politics, positively making wider society compared to other religious groups. I mean, that's a bit weird. We'll come back to that. So then he says, how do we define this? And he's got a concise definition and he expands it into 4 points. His concise definition is Christian nationalism is a distinct political theology that requires Christianity to have a preferential position in public life and promotes an ethno-cultural view of nationhood. So we'll break that down as he does, because he makes 4 points out of it. Number one, Christian nationalism depends on a Christian origin story of a nation. That's what he says. And he says the call for a nation to return to its Christian roots requires a story to be told of how Christianity is integral to the nation. That's true. A call to return to Christian roots requires that. But Christian nationalism more generally doesn't require a Christian origin story of a nation, because a Christian in any nation would obviously want to see their nation become a Christian nation, whatever that means we can discuss. Christian nations have become Christian nations. So I don't think you rely on that to be a Christian nationalist in general. So I don't agree with that part of his definition. Then point 2 from Danny Webster, he says, Christian nationalism requires Christianity to have an ongoing preferential positioning, society, culture, and the formation of laws and institutions of the nation. And he says then the logic is that if Christianity is right, why won't we take steps to show it plays a central role? Well, that's flawless logic. Totally agree. Yes, Christianity should have an ongoing preferential position in society, culture, formation of laws and institutions of the nation. We'll come back to that, but he's right on this bit, right? Then point 3 from Webster, Christian nationalism outworks a particular ethno-cultural view of nationhood as God ordained. And that's what he says. And he says, for example, England belongs to the English, leading on Acts 17:26. From one man, he made all the nations that they should inhabit the whole earth, and he marked out their appointed times in history and the boundaries of their lands. Acts 17:26 does not mention necessarily ethnic groups, I don't think. Appointed times and boundaries of lands, yes, I agree. Not everyone is going to agree with that, and certainly I don't agree that it requires an ethno-cultural view of nationhood as God ordained. Certainly there are some people who would say that, but I don't know any Christians who say that. Most Christians say nations comprise of the people who are in it, and they identify with the nation for particular reasons, and lots of non-Jews ended up being part of the nation of Israel, for example. You can see that in the Exodus, many of the Egyptians joined them, and in various other contexts, there's lots of other non-Jews joining, and obviously you have examples like Rahab and so on as well. So this ethnocentric view of nation doesn't stand up biblically, even with the nation of Israel, let alone the nation of Britain. And then point 4 from Webster, Christian nationalism has a low view of the value of democracy in society. Well, where does he get that from? I mean, I don't know anybody who's saying that. So I think that's nonsense. A Christian nationalist would say that we want to evangelize society, and democracy is a good way of balancing power and in a context of a fallen world, and meaning that people have a voice in it, and meaning that there's opportunity to overthrow the government if you don't like what they're doing, and appoint a new government and so on. And we have to persuade people to become Christians and vote Christian ways and do all that kind of thing. So I don't agree with that. So I wrote a letter to Premier Magazine about this article, sort of saying, well done for tackling the subject. Webster's right. A lot depends on how you define it, but his definition isn't good because, he's wrong about Christian origin. He's wrong about a particular ethnocultural view. He's wrong about low view of democracy, but he's right about a preferential position. But who wouldn't want a preferential position? I mean, I use the example of primary schools where you were, and you still do, supposed to teach Christian ethics and Christian values into school pupils. And the law still says that there should be an act of Christian worship in schools. And what would you prefer? Would you prefer that there was a secular preferential position, so you couldn't do any Christian stuff in schools? Would you prefer there's an Islamic position? Because the point is there's no neutrality here. So you can't opt for a neutral option. Any option is either going to glorify God or it's not going to glorify it. It's either trying to do what God wants or it's trying not to do what God wants. And there are these competing ideologies of Islam and progressivism and secularism. They want preferential positions, you bet, right? So why are we Christians saying we don't want preferential positions? You know, and the fact is that the Christian values and Christian ethics and Christian systems of the nation are what is best for everyone, because, you know, Christianity has a standard of justice from the Bible, a standard of righteousness from the Bible that is the best standard of righteousness and the best standard of justice and righteousness for everyone, and ethics and marriage and family and all of these things are good for everyone, and nations flourish best when they follow God's ways. So I sort of took objection to him inferring that it'd be wrong for Christians, because he said there was a low support for that and so on. He implied that it's wrong to think that Christianity have a preferential position in society and cultural laws and so on. I'm like, surely it's right. What do you want? Do you want it to be a non-Christian preference? I mean, it's going to be a preference somewhere, you know. And this is the big thing, Bob, that, you know, Christians today, you know, we do this Wilberforce Academy, and the big thing we drum through in that is there is no neutrality. There's not a neutral position for schools to have. For example, I did a talk just the other week at our education conference on the myth of neutrality in education. There's no neutral position on the spirituality of a nation, or where the nation gets their values from. Where do you get your laws from is coming from, you know, your laws are defining your ethics, and where you get your ethics from, that's your God. So, you know, you're getting your laws from somewhere. If you're not getting them from God's law, you're getting it from somewhere else. And it's, so, you know, it's ultimately religious in nature. So this is really where I got to with Webster's article. Really, he sort of articulates different kinds of nationalism. I don't find that very interesting, you know, but the nostalgic nationalists and the more politically interested ones and the theological ones and the various other ones. I was more interested in how he defines it, and I think he's trying to define it in a way that makes it look bad, but a way that very few people would actually say, well, that's what I want, you know. So I would define Christian nationalism as wanting the nation to be as Christian as possible, let's say. Or, you know, to put it a bit more formally, a Christian nationalist believes that nations flourish best when they follow God's ways, or flourish best when they self-consciously try and have laws and culture following Christian values based on the Bible, or something like this. That's a simple definition. And what Christian would disagree with that? What Christian wouldn't want the Christian nation to flourish best by, or thinks that nations wouldn't flourish best if they followed God's ways? I mean, the psalmist says, blessed is the nation whose God is the Lord, in Psalm 33. So clearly that was what we should want for any nation, that it has God as its Lord. And, you know, we are a nation that has been very explicitly Christian in our laws, in our culture. And as you know, I spoke on Friday night about the coronation oath and how King Charles was presented with a Bible in the context of all of the regalia of royalty and the crown jewels and the symbols of authority and empire and power and wealth. And they present the Bible and say, this is the most valuable thing in the world. This book. These are the lively oracles of God. This is what princes and rulers should read. And that's been said to every king or queen in coronation for centuries. And it shows a very strong sense of, you know, we as a nation recognize that the most valuable thing we have is the Bible. That's so powerful. That's so amazing. Isn't that a wonderful heritage to have, right? And we self-consciously based our laws on, you know, originally King Alfred, the Ten Commandments, and on biblical law. And right up till the 20th century, judges were saying Christianity is part of the law of England, and, you know, using biblical principles to make their judgments. And but you know, in the last 50 years or so, we've turned our backs on that and denied that Christianity's got anything to do with laws and all this kind of stuff. And consequently, we're reaping a sort of whirlwind of judgment in all sorts of ways. So that's probably enough from me to kick us off, Bob, yeah?
Brilliant. I've got down a bunch of things that I want to talk to you about when we come back to talk to this, but I've got about 3 sides of commentary note on this article. So I'm going to whip through it quickly and make sure that I try and stick to 25 minutes. So that'll land us nicely on the 50-minute mark. So I'll just jump straight in and then we'll get chatting.
Great.
And so my first question would be, given what Danny has said in the article, my question to the Evangelical Alliance and Christian Premier Radio is, do they want less Islam, more Islam, or about the same amount of Islam in the UK? Because there's only one correct answer to that question that a Christian can give. And if you want less Islam, how is it that it's okay for you to want less Islam, but it's not okay for patriots to want less Islam? Why is it okay for nice middle-class Christians in the Evangelical Alliance to want less Islam, but it's wrong if working-class patriots want it? And obviously, all Christians are committed to the idea of less Islam, not just in the UK, but across the world. And I just want to know if Christian Premier Radio can sign up to that, or the Evangelical Alliance. I think it's, he asked the question about whether we're we are seeing a Christian nationalism in this country, and he asked whether it's a good thing, and I want to say that it is. It's an opportunity. It comes with its problems. There's no doubt about that. Any way that you try to make Christianity live and be lived comes with problems. And some of those problems are the risk of it being captured by a 1950s kind of jingoism, or a risk of it being captured by ethno-nationalists, and both of those things that committed Christians should be on the guard against. It allows Christians to organize themselves culturally and politically beyond mere pietism, or beyond just doing the basics of evangelism. Christianity is becoming fashionable on the political right. And so we need to be clear as Christians about what Christianity permits, what Christianity encourages, what it forbids, and what it discourages. And the only way to think, when the moment you start thinking in those terms, you're suddenly thinking like a Christian nationalist, and you're right. The definition is all important. I think that's an absolutely key point, and I'm sure we'll spend some good time talking about definitions later. I've got the full list of definitions that were given by the Christian Nationalist Fellowship at our last meeting that we could talk to. And like you, I observed that like 61% said that the UK is a Christian country and this should be reflected in its laws. Well, there you go. That's 61% that are in some way, to some degree, bought into a Christian nationalist way of thinking. And then 20% said that it should be a preferential position in its politics and policy making and wider society compared to other religions. 20%. So we're not an insignificant minority in evangelical circles, and I think that'll probably be reflected across nearly all the different Christian denominations. And that means that there is solidly out there a Christian nationalist body of people. And so, what is the Evangelical Alliance and Christian Premier Radio trying to suggest? That all these people have misunderstood their faith? Are they being dismissive of this group? So what makes someone a Christian nationalist is that they agree with one of the definitions that was given by the Christian Nationalist Fellowship. Now, we're going to discuss them all, and you've given yours. I'll give mine. My understanding of Christian nationalism is that the church is a nation, and as a body of people that are bound together, not by blood and soil, but by the covenant and by the waters of baptism and the living presence of the Spirit and the discipleship in the Lord Jesus Christ, that we have political, economic, social, and cultural concerns that we can and should pursue, whether we're in power or not. But if we do end up in the levers of power by the predestination and ordinance of God, then we should pursue the same political, economic, social, and cultural concerns, but using the instruments of state. You know, and I challenge any Christian to tell me what's wrong with that idea. Are they trying to say that Christians have less rights because they're Christians? That they don't have as much right to pursue their own concerns as other groups do? What exactly is your complaint? Now, Daniel Webster's definition, like you, I have great problems with. And the reason for that is that he's mixing Christian nationalism with ethno-nationalism when he says the ethno-cultural view of nationhood. You know, I do know that there are some people that have more emphasis on the nation, and to be fair, Danny does point out that there's 4 different kinds of Christian nationalist, some that emphasize the Christian more, some that emphasize the nation more. And so, to be fair to him, he does make some good points. And I do feel in the article he is trying to be alive to the nuances involved in this conversation. I don't feel that this is the kind of trolling that progressive Channel 4 media would do. I think it's much more responsible and well thought out than that. But his blending of ethno-nationalism with Christian nationalism is ultimately to mischaracterize what the Christian nationalist project is. So going on, you know, Christian nationalists in the UK do want to protect our Christian heritage. And what's wrong with that? You know, but the point is, a Christian nationalist in Saudi Arabia hasn't got a Christian heritage to protect, but they can still be a Christian nationalist. And so this is also faulty in his definition and in his understanding of Christian nationalism. Because I think whatever our definition of Christian nationalism is, it has to be something that any Christian could pick up and use at any point in the last 2,000 years of Christian history, whatever his socioeconomic and political contexts are. And so that means that it can't be it can't be fused to the idea of a Christian nation pre-existing. But it doesn't have to be, is what I'm trying to say. It can be, but it doesn't have to be. I don't think he talked about the concerns of if Christian nationalism became the modus operandi of the state, that this would oppress others who weren't Christian based upon Christian values. And this goes to your point about there's no such thing as neutrality, because liberal and progressive societies have oppressed and taken away the rights of Christians. And if Danny Webster isn't willing to say that we're living in a tyranny now, why does he suppose that when there's a Christian nationalist government, God willing, that would then result in tyranny and oppression? Is he willing to say that the liberal state that he works with in Parliament is tyrannical and oppressive to Christians? Will he put that on record? Is that the viewpoint of the Evangelical Alliance? If he's not willing to say that, why does he assume that living by Christian values would result in that kind of oppression? Not everybody's liberal, not everybody's progressive, you know. And certainly if there was a Sharia system in place, we'd definitely be being oppressed, you know. So what's his preference exactly? And he asked the question, do we want to impose a religious test on those that take office in government? And my answer to that as a Christian nationalist is absolutely yes, we do. You know, I would want to see a religious test on those that enter into office. But there needs to be a debate around what kind of test. Because in my mind, I can imagine a test that would still allow a Hindu or a Muslim to enter into political office. But they would have to commit and agree to the idea of upholding the Christian character and nation, laws and values of society. And if they were found not to be doing that, yeah, something to discuss. If they were found not to be doing that, they could move from office without an election. You know, liberal society is oppressing Christians, and Islamic society would oppress Christians. You know, but so my question is, why does Danny and the Evangelical Alliance value this liberal form of tolerance when I cannot find it anywhere in the Bible? I can't find it anywhere in the Christian faith. And since the state has to be governed by some political narrative, why does he preference Enlightenment liberalism over the idea of a apostolic Christianity? Why is the Enlightenment liberal narrative more preferable than a Christian one? Mm-hmm. You know, he talked about a confident pluralism. And I just want to ask him, you know, does that mean he's in favor of legalizing polygamy? Is he in favor of normalizing and ratifying Sharia courts into the system of UK law? What exactly would be the scope that he would allow Sharia courts to operate, and how would he choose that which in which Sharia courts could operate? Would he allow for divorce to be declared by mere pronouncement repeated 3 times? Would he allow for arranged marriages? After all, he's talking about a confident pluralism that can accept difference. So why not these things? Would he allow marriage for minors, children? Would he support people's right to abort their children to any point? Does he agree with allowing gay marriage to have an equal footing to the Christian definition of marriage? You know, what does he mean by confident pluralism, and how is he going to define its limits? Because something tells me he will appeal to his Christianity to define some of those limits. And the moment he does, how is he any different to us? It's just that we're doing it more extensively and more coherently to a Christian worldview. We would simply have further restrictions, like we do want to see a pathway to the end of abortion. I wouldn't want the Adhan to be broadcast on loudspeaker into people's homes. I would outlaw child circumcision. I would outlaw halal and kosher meat. Now, we might disagree on some of those points, can debate them if we want to, but the point is, how are we coming to our conclusions? And it seems to me that the Evangelical Alliance, through at least in Danny Webster's position and Christian Premier Radio, are syncretizing Christianity with liberalism. Now, he talked about immigration. Obviously, that's a big factor in many within the patriotic movement who are most open to Christianity. Now, I just want to point out there's nothing wrong with a nation placing restrictions on who lives within its borders. That's a completely normal thing, a completely normal practice. And I totally agree that the judgment shouldn't be based upon ethnicity. It should be based upon cultural compatibility amongst other questions. So, for instance, a Christian Pakistani is going to be a more conducive migrant to the cultural matrix of the UK than a Muslim Pakistani or a Hindu Pakistani. There's nothing racist about that observation. That's just a fact. The Enlightenment, he talked about, he did the Tom Holland thing and the Glenn Scrivener thing, which I disagree with, which is this idea that saying that it is the Bible that gave us liberty, freedom, and democracy. Now, it was a bit of a clumsy sentence in the article because liberty means freedom. So I'm not quite sure what he means by liberty, freedom, and democracy, because he's essentially saying freedom, freedom, democracy. But clumsy sentences are allowed. I've written clumsy sentences myself. But where's that in the Bible? You know, the liberal understanding of freedom is not the biblical understanding of freedom. The biblical understanding of freedom is the knowledge and relationship that is found in the Lord Jesus Christ and in the truth. Liberal concepts of freedom are simply about the affirmation of your right to choose in a multiplicity of choices. Truth be damned. And democracy is obviously not biblical. It isn't something that comes from Scripture. And Christians have lived through different political systems all the way through. It isn't the case that Christian nationalists therefore don't value democracy. I value it because it allows us a peaceful means to change governments.
Yeah.
And we are meant to be peacemakers. And so we do that which builds peace. And so from a purely pragmatic point of view, democracy builds peace. And so that's why I'm in favor of democratic systems. But he also mentioned about, he seemed incredulous and mocked the idea of wanting to strike a blow against those who seek to erode our Christian heritage. Well, my question is, what's wrong with that idea? That there are people who are dedicated to de-Christianizing our society. What's wrong with standing up to them? What's wrong with pushing back? What's wrong with undermining their agenda? What's wrong with defeating their agenda and building on, restoring, and reinvigorating our Christian heritage? There's nothing wrong with Christians wanting to do that. And we all know that Christ has been taken out of Christmas. It is a commercialized holiday. It is a secularized holiday in which Christ is not the center of the season in general culture and society. What's wrong with wanting to put that back in and reversing the whitewashing of our confident, pluralistic, multicultural, commercialized Christmas? And so I really don't understand what his problem is there. Now, the accusation of racism is all over his article, both implied and overtly stated. But yet he didn't give any evidence in his statement of the Christian nationalists being racist or the patriotic movement being racist. And I just want to know on what grounds does he make that claim? Because this is a claim that's bandied about all the time. But I've never yet seen anyone quote anyone or show any video or quote any article to justify the accusation. And that's kind of my problem. It's become this kind of cliche, bourgeois, comfortable refrain, you're a racist. And it's kind of like saying in the medieval period, you're a witch. You're guilty by accusation. No evidence needed. Now we're going to take you and duck you in the water. It's kind of like, where's your evidence for the accusation? So those were some of my thoughts on it, and I've got a few minutes spare. So I'll stop there, and we'll just open it up for a bit of a conversation between me and you. So any thoughts?
I mean, I think I probably agree with most of what you're saying there, Bob. I think we're roughly on the same page, really, in terms of where we're trying to get to and what our responses are to this kind of article. I would, not take issue with your definition, but I'd prefer to define it a different way. But we can get into that if we want to.
Yeah, let's. Do you want me to read out some of the definitions that came out of the CNFUK?
Well, just so let's just go between you and me for now. So
Yeah.
I'm saying that Christian nationalism is wanting the nation to be as Christian as possible. Let's say that's one way, or that's a simple way of defining it. Or to say that a Christian nationalist believes that nations flourish best when they follow God's ways, as in, having self-consciously, deliberately trying to have laws based and culture based on Christian principles found in the Bible. Now you sort of have a more complicated theological definition, don't you? Tell me yours again.
Yeah, so mine is that the church itself is a nation. And as a body of people, as a community, as a people brought together by God, we have, like every other community does, social, political, economic, and cultural interests that it is right for us to pursue. The reason why I go with that definition is two reasons. One, because it allows for it to be used in a pre-Westphalian sense, before the invention of the nation state or the creation of the nation state. And it doesn't require Christians to be in power. Christians can pursue this ideology, whether they're in power or not.
Well, I don't think my definition requires that either.
No, I agree. I don't think our definitions necessarily conflict. I think maybe one of the differences.
I just think, like, because when you say we as Christians are a nation, right? There's truth in that, spiritually and theologically, because the Bible says so, right? But it's a different kind of nation to the nations of the world. I mean, even Jesus says, "My kingdom is not of this world. If it were, my servants would fight to prevent my arrest. But now my kingdom is from another place." So it's the nation of Christians, so to speak, is not a political entity. It's not a geopolitical entity. It's a spiritual entity. It's a different kind of kingdom or a different kind of nation. And so I just think you're going to confuse people, Bob, by starting saying Christian nationalism believes that Christians are a nation and they sort of should have the right to pursue their interests, kind of thing. I just think that's confusing, because when everyone else talks about nations all the rest of the time, they mean geopolitical entities. And when you talk about Christians as a nation, you're not talking about a geopolitical entity, and so it's kind of confusing.
Well, let me come back on that, because so firstly, the thing is Christian nationalism has more than one school of thought. And so for those that might be watching this and you're completely new to Christian nationalism, and you might be wondering, well, if these two are both Christian nationalists, they can't seem to agree. Well, just like Marxism has a number of different schools of thought, and just like liberalism has a number of different schools of thought, well, Christian nationalism has a number of different schools of thought. And so, there are internal debates to the movement. But to come back to your point, if we define politics as where influence, power, and authority are conspicuously at play, that's politics in its broadest sense. And therefore, even though the church is something that is super statist, it is super kingdom, it is above every kingdom and empire because it is not of this world. The church exists in a politicized world. It acts with authority, power, and influence, both within itself, within society, and within the state apparatus. And so the church is at once political, even if it's not
Bob, I don't disagree, right, with all that you're saying. I just think you're going to confuse people by defining it in that way.
Well, I think people need to get a bit more educated on this nation, because the definition of what nation that we're using is coming from the Treaty of Westphalia.
I don't agree with you. I'm using a definition from the Bible that starts with nations in the Tower of Babel. So I don't.
Those were tribes, weren't they?
Well,
they weren't states.
Well, they weren't states in the modern sense of the word, but they were nations that ended up having their own language, borders, land.
But not in every case. Not in every case. Well, there were many nations within the Persian Empire. There were many nations in the Babylonian Empire. There are many nations in the Mongol Empire. So it isn't the idea of nation did not biblically necessitate borders in a kingdom.
Well, okay, so what it necessitates some kind of shared history, shared language, shared culture, shared origin, shared
sense
of identity, and ideally an aspiration at least for a shared land and a common law and this kind of thing. So you've got to have at least those kind of things to sort of generalize it more specifically, so to speak. We define nations along those kind of. A nation is a group of people that have those kind of things in common. Basically.
True, but the reason why I'll move us on after you've replied to this to some of the other points. But in terms of the reason why I adopt that definition, it's because I think biblically that the Bible talks about nations as ethnos, people who are bound together by blood and soil and language and history and culture. But then it says that the church is drawn out of that, and so it's pointing towards from the natural nation to the supernatural nation, from the natural nation of blood and soil to the nation of the church. And I think it's important to emphasize that bit so that you don't leave the back door open to the ethno-nationalists.
I understand that, and I respect those motives, and that's all good. And it's not like I disagree with your definition. It's just I don't think it's the most helpful way. I just think it's going to confuse people. But maybe I'm wrong. But
a healthy debate to be had
on the kind of ethno point, though. Just because the Greek word is ethnos doesn't mean that it meant that a nation has to be exclusively ethnic one or something like that. Like I said, even the Jewish nation wasn't one particular.
Well, yes, and that's the point that I think that's a good point that ethno-nationalists need to hear, because ethno-nationalists who are trying to cloak themselves in Christianity often try to shoehorn that way of interpreting, that schema of interpretation into Scripture, and it's not supported by Scripture. So it's really good that you raise that.
Yeah,
I want to move on to this point about neutrality, because I think it's really crucial.
Yeah,
Christians need to understand, and I'm sure we're both just going to be punching in the same direction on this one, but Christians need to understand that there really isn't a neutral narrative that governs the state. The state has to be governed by a narrative. And since Westphalia and the Enlightenment, the narrative that the state has been governed by is the idea of the state's own success and the state's own survival, which increasingly from 1790 onwards has become increasingly decoupled from Christianity and replaced by liberalism. And so there isn't some secular neutral state out there. You're going to either have a liberal state, a Christian state, an Islamic state, or something else, but there's always an ideology governing what the state values and what the state seeks to achieve in the world and within its own society. And as Christians, what we're trying to put, me and Tim, is we're trying to say, well, actually, Christianity should be that governing narrative. And I don't think that Danny Webster maybe appreciates that properly, or that Christian Premier Radio appreciates that properly, because they seem to assume that the liberal secular state is somehow neutral, and it isn't,
and it can't be. Yes, and that's kind of the point, isn't it? Yes, where I do a talk at our Wilford's Academy on legislating morality, and I was trying to sort of talk about that a little bit earlier on. But the point is that every law is enforcing some morality, right? It's there's a moral question involved, like what should be illegal, what should be legal, what the punishment should be, what the punishment should not be, and how high taxes should be, how low taxes should be, what things should be taxed, what things should not be taxed, and what taxes should be used for. These are all moral questions. Every single political question is a moral question. And so then the question is, where do you get those morals from? How do you decide which things to legislate for? Where is your morality coming from? Well, whatever decides your morality is your God, because that's determining what you believe is right or wrong. So, that somewhere at the source of our laws and the laws that we enact, the new laws we enact and the ones we scrap, is a decision to choose one morality over another, or one system of right and wrong over another, or one God over another, ultimately at the end of the day. So there's no neutrality in the mix of all of that at all. There cannot be any neutrality. It's coming from some system that determines what's right and wrong for you, and whatever determines what's right and wrong for you is your God, and whatever determines what is right and wrong for the nation is the God of that nation. And that's kind of how it works, really. And we've been tearing apart Christian laws, like I said, for the last 50 years, because we've been deliberately deciding that's not where we're getting our morals from anymore. We're going to get them from somewhere else. And
Go on, I'll let you land.
No, you carry on.
Yeah, I was going to say that from about the 1960s,
Yeah.
a process that started in the 1790s has just gone mainstream and normalized in our culture. And we've kind of thrown off any last vestiges of pretense. But for me, the rot starts back in the 1790s. And I'll let you decide when we move on from this particular topic and where we go next. But I would just say that when I explain it to people, the way that you do this is you have a good understanding of your base narrative, the Christian narrative. That narrative is pinned in by and gives rise to essential doctrines. Those essential doctrines give rise to values, and on those values you create laws. So if you're creating laws, every law that you create is going to indicate a value or not, or something that it doesn't value. And in liberal society, the thing that they value the most is individual freedom. And I put freedom in quote marks because their definition of freedom is not the biblical definition of freedom. So individual liberty is of that tantamount and highest importance. But that results in the kind of society that says you can abort a child when you want, you can commit suicide if you don't like to, we'll legalize euthanasia. You can divorce easily. You can marry whoever you want, or even an object. You can buy whatever you want, and so it is this overemphasis on individualized freedom that is creating these distortions. And when you add to that the sort of oppression pyramid of intersectionality, you end up with wild distortions and spiraling spasms of the pursuit of isolated virtues like we see in our progressive culture today.
Well, I agree. One of the gods that our society is pursuing at the moment is the sort of god of self-identity, or the god of I make myself, I define who I am, and so if I say that I trans or whatever I might be, it's blasphemous to accuse me of or suggest that I might be wrong about who I am, because I define who I am, and who are you to say who I am not and what I am and all of this kind of stuff. And I define what I think is right and wrong. I define what I can do. And so it's kind of like human autonomy seems to be the new god of the age almost in a way, or it has been, or it is at the moment. That kind of human autonomy that says we make ourselves, we define ourselves, we decide what we can do, and the sort of human rights, becomes like entitlement, and my entitlements, and it'd be much better to have my duties, really, in that sense. Rather than human rights, have human duties. I have a duty to love my neighbor, I have a duty to care for my neighbor, I have a duty to respect my neighbor, my neighbor's humanity, and this kind of thing. So you could frame it that way, and that might help people. But but also, when you talk about values, I do want to also emphasize that biblical law is the standard of righteousness, isn't it? It says that clearly in Psalm 19 and Psalm 119 as well. And Deuteronomy 4 says, what other nation is so great as have such righteous decrees and laws as this body of laws that I'm setting before you today? In other words, these are the best laws for any nation. And following these laws is going to make you a great nation. This because you'll have the best stand. People will look at you and think, wow, where did you, actually says here, other people look and say, surely this great nation is a wise and understanding people because you've got these amazing laws. And that's because God gave them to you. And when the prophets rail against the other nations, they don't just rail against Israel, they rail against the other nations and they accuse them of sins. According to biblical law, you have transgressed my law. You've done wrong things. Look at Amos chapter 1. For 3 sins of this country, even for 4, I'm not going to turn back my wrath because you've done these things that are contrary to biblical law. And it's implied that every nation should follow this law, even though it was particularly revealed to Israel. There is ultimately one God, and he's the God of all the nations. And so every nation should be following these kind of things. And when they don't, God is going to judge them. And that is what he's doing at the moment with our nation. And so, we should want to go back, as King Alfred did, to the 10 Commandments and form our laws based around those kind of things, which obviously includes marriage and adultery and all of these things are in there and so on, and
I think
family.
I think it comes. I think this whole emergence of Christian nationalism within the patriot movement is, as you've quite rightly said, and as Danny Webster observed as well, that it's coming from a search for identity. You know, the thing is that what's happened is because of things like lockdown, things like the trans lobby in the way that it went after children, and it forced people to ask questions. And I've heard this story more than once. People felt that something evil was happening, and that confirmation that evil was real all sent them into a chain of thought that made them arrive at the existence of good and therefore God. And as people reacted to that, particularly on the right, they started to look for a foundation for their beliefs. And as they started to dig downwards within the right spectrum of politics, the thing that they kept encountering at every level was Christianity, Christianity, Christianity. And all the way down through the national story here in England, Christianity has played a role. Alfred the Great and his son and grandson created their project was a project of creating a Christian nation. And from that time to this, the English people, by that I mean Saxon people, have always been bound to Christianity, have always been bound to the church via the monarchy. And there's been that tripod of church, people, and monarchy. And those have been the constants in our constitutional arrangement. But of all of them, the only thing that didn't change is Christianity. The church changed, the monarchies changed, the people changed in sense of their language and their cultural expressions, but their link to the Christian faith has been the one constant of England. And whilst Danny Webster is wrong to say that Christian nationalism requires an origin story for the nation, because as I think you said when the Christian Nationalist Fellowship had its meeting, you said, that's wrong because the nations convert. Armenia converted.
And we're glad that they do, and we're pleased that they do, and let's hope that more of them do. Yeah,
exactly. And let's hope Britain does. So it's not true that Christian nationalism requires a Christian origin story to a nation. But it is true that in the English context, in the British context, there is a Christian origin story that we can appeal to as part of our heritage. And there's nothing wrong with that. Your thoughts?
I completely agree. And obviously I wrote an article in the year of the King's coronation, 2023, about King Lucius, who is the first Christian king of Britain. I mean, people go back to King Alfred and so on, but King Lucius, according to traditions, which are there's plenty of it, like good evidence. He was king for like 77 years, and he did convert to Christianity, and he planted churches and dioceses and things like that, and appointed bishops and so on all over the land. And you've got in St. Peter's, I think it is, a plaque about this church was originally founded by King Lucius in there, which is replacing a plaque that was previously there for centuries before that, and so on. Anyway, you can read that article, but there is a very strong Christian origin story in Britain that goes back to the first or second century, and you had Pelagians were heretics that were British. Well, if you've got Christian heretics, then you must have true Christians as well, right? So that's pretty early in the history of the church, and there's evidence of people coming to Britain within maybe the first or second centuries, actually, of the Christian era. So there's a long Christian history. Yes, and yes, there's no harm harking back to that, saying, look, this is what made Britain great. This is, much as it says in the Bible, as I was just reading Deuteronomy 4 verse 6, people will say, sure, this nation is great and wise and understanding people because they've got these great laws. Well, I think people did say that of Britain in the past, sure, they're such a great, wise people because they had good laws, because they were based on the Bible, but now they're not. And so we're not such a great nation anymore, and we shy away from calling ourselves great, and so on. So but
I do want
whose God is the Lord, and we were blessed by having God as our nation, and go back again to the coronation oath and all of that. So yes, there's a very strong Christian heritage in this nation, and there's a nostalgia for it, that is, people are looking back to that, partly because Islam is provoking them, and people are thinking, well, I don't want to be an Islamic nation, but what nation do I want to be? And they're sort of realizing that there isn't a neutrality. You're not going to defeat Islam by saying, oh, we'll just be neutral. No, it needs some kind of spiritual way to respond to it, and the answer is Christianity, actually. And so this is what is prompting people to return to Christianity, and the aim of God's judgment is to provoke us to repentance, and I hope and pray that is what is starting to happen as we see like record Bible sales and increased interest in Christianity across the nation and so on.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at the symbols of the state, I forget which crown it is. I think it's the crown of state, actually. It's got a relic of Saint Edward the Confessor in there. His signet ring was a ruby stone,
right?
Or was it a sapphire? Oh, I forget. I'm not very good at stones. But it was the blue one. Is that a sapphire or is that sapphire, a ruby?
Yeah,
sapphire. Yeah, it's it's a relic of Saint Edward the Confessor that's right there in the crown that sits upon the head of the monarch. You've got Saint Alban, who was the first martyr known to the church and celebrated. And the thing is, there's nothing wrong with people being proud of that heritage. But the wonderful thing about Christian nationalism, it says to any Christian immigrant or any convert to Christianity in this land that this heritage now becomes yours as part of the confederacy of the church.
Yeah.
You can celebrate these things as whether you were born here or not. The fact that you're a Christian means that you can celebrate these things. Just like I can celebrate the achievements of the Armenian church in Armenia, or the Ethiopian church in Ethiopia, or the Thomist Christians in India, because as Christians, we're bound together in this common identity in Christ, which means that those who maybe were born in Pakistan and then convert to Christianity here in the UK, they can claim the heritage, the Christian heritage, as theirs via the Christian faith. Just a quick question, Tim, and if you've got other points that you want to raise from my talk, do feel free. But when do you think was the last time that the UK was a Christian nation?
Well, you see, that depends what you define a Christian nation as, isn't it?
Well, that's the point. That's why I'm asking.
So you can define a Christian nation in lots of different ways. One of them is like a majority of the people of the nation identify as Christians. I mean that we only just slipped away from that, didn't we? The last 10 years in the last census, we dropped to below 40. It was 46%, wasn't it? And it had been for hundreds of years. Well, as long as the census has been going, the majority of people had identified a Christian. So by that measure, you'd be a Christian nation. You could say you define a Christian nation by the nation itself identifying as a Christian nation in some form. And in a sense, we still do. I think every prime minister.
Well, constitutionally, we are.
Constitutionally, well, that's another point. That's another point. Yes, but prime ministers. I think every prime minister recently. I'm not sure Starmer has said we're a Christian nation. But every prime minister, Thatcher onwards and so on, has said we're a Christian nation, and then constitutionally we are a Christian nation, and the coronation oath and everything is very explicitly Christian and so on. So, but we have lost quite a lot of these things. So constitutionally we are still a Christian nation, and self-identifyingly we're umming and ahhing about it, right? Which is partly why we're having this debate, right? We're umming and ahhing with some of us will say we're Christian, some of us we're not. What did Danny Webster say in his article from his survey? It said, I think 60% say of Christians say we're a Christian nation, wasn't it? Find it. 61% said the UK is a Christian country that should be affected its laws. So a lot of Christians still believe we're a Christian country. In that sense, but most other people would not say we're a Christian country. They'd say we're something else, probably. But I'm not clear about that, because part of the attraction when Muslims come to this country is that it is a Christian country in their mind, and then they come here and they're shocked by the immorality and our laws and culture and all that kind of thing, and so they think if that's Christianity, they're put off it. But in that respect, because we're not exhibiting, we're not witnessing to being a Christian nation in a way that a Christian nation ought to witness to being a Christian nation.
Yeah.
In that sort of way. So, so when we lost it, I don't know, but like you're right, we started tearing apart Christian laws 50 years ago in the 1960s, and we've been tearing them apart ever since. And we've gone to these crazy things of abortion on demand and abortion up to birth and no fault divorce and redefining marriage even, and all of these crazy things, and we're reaping the fruits of it, and opening all people to come into our nation from all different cultures, assuming that all cultures are equal. Well, they're not, and all this kind of stuff is what's causing the nation to fall away, and we're reaping the whirlwind of our own folly in turning away from God and believing that we can go it our own way.
Very much so. And I think that for me, I think that we stopped being a Christian nation when we started organizing ourselves around the principles of the Enlightenment.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, no, and I put that rot then back into the early 1800s. But then the effects of that took until the 1960s until it became evident to all undeniably that we'd ceased.
I mean, the other way to look at it, Bob, is
if I could just because I would just say though that the thing is, and it's a point that you've made, is that constitutionally we are still a Christian Christian nation, and so for us to say that we want to be a functioning Christian theocracy, because on paper we are, the head of state is the head of church and head of state.
Depending how you find the theocracy,
to want our constitution to function as it is written is something that I would, wholeheartedly support. And why shouldn't Christians aspire for that? There's nothing wrong with that aspiration.
Yes.
Is there any point that you want to raise?
All the doctrines that it actually has in its canons and the 13 articles, and actually believe that stuff. Yes, I agree.
Well, at this point, I'd be happy probably to swap churches out and change the Church of England to maybe the Confessing Church of England or GAFCON or something. But I'm committed to a Christian state, not a Church of England state. If the Church of England doesn't want to be Christian, then we can get rid of them. But
fair enough. Yeah.
Is there any points you want to raise? Because I can keep raising my points, but I just want to give you a chance to raise any points that you want to talk about. Keep driving the conversation.
Yes, I think so. Yeah, keep going.
Okay, so obviously there is this question about a low view of democracy, and I think certainly in my school of thought of Christian nationalism, Danny's not entirely wrong, because I'm not in favour of a liberal democracy. I want a Christian democracy, and I think that his definition of democracy just assumes a liberal framework.
How do you differentiate between a Christian?
Well, I mean, I would be much more in favour of a monarchical system in which the monarchy plays a real role in the governing of the state. There would be a democratic element, but it would look very different from a liberal kind of democracy, where the king is.
I wouldn't go for that. I would have I would modify democracy somewhat, right?
How would you modify it?
I would want to say that stakeholders have a vote, which means that you're a taxpayer. Broadly speaking, you're a taxpayer. You're a contributor to society in that sort of way, and therefore, if you're on benefits or you're in prison or something like that, you don't get a vote. So you have to be a taxpayer or have been a taxpayer or something like that, that kind of thing. So once you are contributing to society, then you get a vote. Put it that way. And if you're not contributing, you don't get a vote, because the people who are contributing to society are the ones who should decide how the taxes are paid. Put it that way. because they're paying the taxes, and so they should decide how the taxes are paid. I think that's a reasonably fair way of looking at it and thinking about it, and that encourages people, incentivizes people to contribute to society as they should be, if they possibly can. So I'll do it that way. But I think democracy is a good system because I think it does have checks and balances in it, that provide for a fallen world, like I was saying, that you can, and you're quite right to emphasize earlier on that peaceful revolution, effectively, peaceful change of government is an amazing thing. It's an amazing thing, and it has meant that we've lived in peace for decades, hundreds of years, really, without revolution. From tyranny, and I worry that if you appoint a king, then and do it that way, you'll end up with tyranny, because that is the nature of the fallen world that we live in. And so, the great thing about democracy is that you have this safeguard against tyranny, that you can vote them out and get rid of them after a period of time, and lobby, and they will be interested in what people think, because because it's a democracy, they have to be interested in what people think. Do you know what I mean? And so people can argue and point out and debate across the whole society about what's right and wrong, and try and win people over. And since we know the truth is on our side as Christians, we should win people over and have confidence that we can win people over. So that's the nature of democracy. And democracy, if we see a Christian revival, we can see a Christian Christianity in government, Christian people in government who will actually stand for Christian principles and Christian values and Christian laws and stuff. And that's what we want. And so, I'm a big fan of democracy. I think it's the best system out there. And,
I think it's fair to say,
I would say it like Churchill: democracy is the worst system of all governments, apart from all the rest. I think it's not perfect, but it's. I don't know what's better than it.
I think it's fair to say that Danny's wrong to say that we have a low view of democracy. I think we both value democracy, but we're not attached to a liberal democracy.
No.
So we would want to jig the system around, but we both recognize the fact that democracy is incredibly successful in peaceful transitions of power, and that gives it merit as a mechanism within statecraft that we would want to preserve. And I think we need to probably touch on the fact
that it kind of values everyone as being in the image of God, and therefore having an equal voice in society equally, everyone, notwithstanding my comments about contributing to society, but everyone, rich, poor, whatever, has a vote, because they're all in the image of God. It's kind of has that kind of aspect to it as well.
Well, but for me, the value of democracy is more its ability to maintain peace and build a peaceful society. Goodluck Johnson in Nigeria was the only, was the first president to hand over power peacefully, because he respected, democracy. As it is better to fight our wars with one another through ballot box than it is through bombs and bullets.
The problems with it are that because we've developed an entitlement culture where people feel the government should solve all their problems and sort everything out and so on, that people vote on the basis of self-interest rather than the basis of national interest necessarily. And I think at some point we're going to come up with a challenge on that, because I think we're going to run out of money and end up with a financial crisis that we haven't seen the likes of before. And people will not, like Greece ran out of money, didn't they? And the euro, because they were in the euro sort of took them over. And in spite of riots on the street, and in spite of, the people voting out a new government, the European Union just said, "Stuff it, we're running your country now because you owe us lots of money." And ultimately you are slave to the debtor, as the Bible says, and it says that about nations in Deuteronomy 28. Right? You'll become, if you're following God's blessing, you'll lend to many nations and be servant of none. But if you're not following God's blessing, you'll borrow from many nations and be servants of them. And that is where we're going to end up. And
it also says in Scripture that it's a blessing to have many sons, and it is a sign of an ill country. It's a sign of an ill nation when sons are sparse. And that's what we're experiencing right now. But I want to move the conversation on, because this is a new topic for the church. And I think we need to just dwell on that for a second, because this kind of conversation is not something that your average Christian will hear on a Sunday. And there is a lot of reaction and reactionary sort of knee-jerk, no, we can't do that kind of within church leadership and too many Christians. And so what for me, I would just point out to them, this is usually how I try to explain it to them, is that since the Enlightenment, Christianity was privatized as part of people's lives. It's like you do it privately, and the state will run everything according to its own.
You'll keep your faith out of politics.
And then during the Victorian period, Christians forced their way back into social issues, and the state kind of went, okay, yeah, we can live with that. We can live with you Christians doing social stuff and talking about social issues. And so the Christians gained a voice there. And then there was this debate about whether Christianity could impact every aspect of our sociocultural, economic, and political thinking. And it wasn't until, I think it was, like maybe because we haven't got an archbishop at the moment. Sarah Mullally not an archbishop. So the two previous archbishops, we've got to jump back about to George Carey, I think. Was it George Carey? The guy with glasses.
Yeah.
The debate around whether Christianity should affect all of our politics was kind of settled with him. The answer was yes. But now that yes has been given, we're now got to have a conversation about, well, what does a Christian politics look like? And that's where Christian nationalism emerges. It emerges from that conversation is, well, what does a Christian agenda look like? What does a Christian political agenda look like? And it emerges from our
and you're right, Christians haven't largely thought about this for the last many decades years. and longer. And so, we're going to have to go back. And on my reading list is Samuel Rutherford's Lex Rex and one or two others. So, let's go back to some books from previous centuries and see what they said about this kind of stuff, and go back to Christian thinkers from the Puritans and other times, and how they were thinking about how they wanted to form a nation, what a nation should be like, and how it should.
Or even earlier, Ambrose and Augustine, and
Bernard
de Clairvaux and Urban the Great.
All of these people, I agree. We've got this long heritage to go back to, because we haven't got any modern books about this, because nobody's really thought about this very much more recently. So let's go back to that heritage and dig out and find it and work it out and think about it. And we're going to have to do that hard work and do that all over again, I think, in this. I mean, just to sort of, add another perspective to your history lesson, Bob, peak Christianity in this nation was 1859, when there was major revivals in various parts of the country, and crowds and crowds of people flocked to the churches, and most people went to church, and pretty much everybody identified as Christian, and the nation was very self-consciously Christian, and Queen Victoria said things like, that were very explicitly Christian. I can't remember exactly now in terms of her speeches, and then and Gladstone was known as a defender of the Bible, and all this kind of stuff. And in a sense, we've kind of been in decline since then. 1859 was the peak, and this decline's been gradual at points and more rapid at other points. But now we are where we are here, and we're still living off the benefits of some of the righteousness and good laws and solid cultural things that were put in place by our forefathers in this nation. But as we tear them apart, those benefits are gradually collapsing. For example, family breakdown, 5% of babies were born outside marriage in 1952 or 3 when the Queen came to the throne, and now it's 45% of babies born outside marriage. That's just a massive statistic. And divorces are much higher with less marriages, and all of this. That's just one statistic that is very indicative of social breakdown.
And I think one of the key differences between our stance and that of Danny Webster is that we are 100% confident that Christianity is the answer that the UK needs.
Yeah.
Whereas Danny Webster, the Christian Premier Radio Station, and the Evangelical Alliance only thinks that either Christianity is only the right answer for certain parts of our society, or are not utterly convinced that Christianity is the right answer for every aspect.
Well, you're quite right in your introduction to pick up on his confident pluralism, because what exactly does he mean by that? What exactly does he mean by that? Like, what is that? Does he think that all religions are equally valid somehow? I mean, surely not, but what is his
Well, let's be
ideal
charitable
state?
and assume not.
What is his ideal? What is his ideal
confident-
position? If his ideal position is pluralism, then I'm sorry, that's not neutral. That's anti-Christian. Ultimately, it's not a Christian state. So it's going to oppress Christianity somewhere or other.
Correct. Yeah, totally agree. Totally agree. And Danny, if you're listening to this, you're more than welcome to come and reply to me and Tim, and I'll try and set up a conversation in a way that you feel comfortable.
He has replied to because I did put a letter in. Letter did get into premature Christianity.
Yeah, I think you kind of got him to roll back on a bit, didn't you?
He commented on my Facebook post about it, saying, because particularly what I really criticised was this point that a preferential position is a bad idea, and I was like, well, surely it's the right idea. What would you? There's no neutrality, and he obviously was irked by it. So he did comment and say, well, maybe that wasn't the best way of expressing it. I think I meant something more like we shouldn't restrict other people's freedom of religion, which
well, hold on a minute, let me ask him then. So does that mean that he's in, like if he doesn't want to restrict people's freedom of religion, does that mean that he wants to legalize polygamy?
Well,
because that is hold on Tim, hold on, because that escapes the bind that says, well, people should be free to practice their religion so long as it doesn't hurt other people. Polygamy, at least at prima facie level, doesn't look like it hurts other people, and so he should surely, by his logic, want to legalize polygamous marriages. If he's not willing to, then he does favor restricting people's religious practices.
Exactly, you're quite right. Yeah, you're quite right. There should be an element of religious freedom, and there should be some element of religious restrictions as well. And ultimately, there should be one law for all that is based on biblical law, and that would include the law of marriage.
Yeah,
in that, marriage is between a man and a woman, and that's it. And you can only divorce on the
one man and one woman.
Exactly. Yes, one man and one woman, rather more precisely expressed. And I don't care whether you're a Muslim or Hindu or whatever you are. Those are the only marriages that we recognise. And by the way, if you're trying to pretend some other marriage, then that's breaking the law. So but yes, you can carry on and be a Muslim and go to mosque and stuff, but you can't do polygamy, and you can't do various other things as well, because we have Christian laws in this country, and if you don't respect those, you'll get in. You won't be welcome here.
Yeah, the problem with his confident pluralism is that ultimately he's leaning on the metaphysics of relativism without realizing it.
Yes,
and if you press into that, the moment you start opening up that confident pluralism, you're going to start building on relativism, and before long you'll end up being a relativist, or you'll end up creating a relativist society. Because he's created a situation where he's going to struggle now to set limits, because the moment he does, you could just ask him, okay, why are you defining those limits there? Where are you getting the metaphysics from for that value? He will appeal to Christianity to do that, and then he's admitting that it is okay to limit people according to Christian values. So we look forward to how we'll get out of that conundrum. So do you want to move on to questions from the audience?
Happy to. I think so.
Yeah. So what we're going to do, guys, we're going to give you the opportunity to ask questions. If you want me to ask a question, actually, let me ask Tim, do you want me just to put the questions up on screen, or shall I invite people in to come and talk to us?
It's up to you, Bob. You choose.
Yeah. I think we'll do both, and we'll see what happens. You can either give a question or a comment. Both are invited, but it must be about the topic. If you're going to write it down, you've got to put @Bob. If you don't put @Bob, you will be ignored. But if you want to come in and ask your question or make your comment in person, you can come in and do so by clicking on the link that I have just put into the live stream. I think it's probably fair to say that, I think Danny is being fair in his article, but he's just sincerely wrong I don't think there's any kind of maliciousness in the same way that, the Guardian might seek to villainize people or any. I don't think he's being.
Well, I think if either one of us had a conversation with him, we'd end up, persuading him that he's pretty much on the same page as us.
Yeah, I think so.
But he I think he's scared of the term nationalism, and that is an issue perhaps we haven't discussed, to be fair, Bob.
Yeah, well, let's talk about it now until someone asks a question.
And I think he's kind of like, brought into a kind of, like you say, a semi-relativistic attitude that pluralism is somehow the best option when it isn't.
Well, I mean, nationalism is a pretty scandalized word because of World War II. The post-war consensus, which is finally falling apart, basically saw nationalism as the road back to Hitler. And just like the Enlightenment was, how do we make sure we never go back to religious wars as seen in the Reformation civil war amongst Christians? The post-war Enlightenment, the post-war consensus was, how do we make sure that we close all paths back to fascism and Hitler? And that's not necessarily a bad thing. Who wants to go back there? But the point is, it has meant that the word nationalism is so toxic for people that they hear it and it just raises all those images of Mussolini and Hitler to them. But that's obviously nonsense. Just because you believe in a Christian form of nationalism doesn't mean that you want fascism. And then obviously, I think because perhaps he's a non-conformist Christian, you've got all those echoes of the time when the Church of England persecuted the non-conformists or discriminated against them. And the result of that has sort of left an indelible imprint upon those forms of Christianity. And so for Christian nationalists, one of the challenges that we face is, how do we envision a Christian society given the fact that there are many different versions or churches of the Christian faith? And have you had a thought about that, and what would be your answer? And the questions are starting to come in now, so I'm going to go to questions.
Let me just come back into the definition of nationalism, because I agree that the word nationalism has been tainted by Nazism, and there's some that's fair enough. Yes, we should all be not wanting to ever go anywhere near down that path again. But to me, a nationalist is really someone who believes in nations being able to take responsibility for their own affairs and having their own destiny, and under God sort of control their own affairs and doing their own thing, which is basically how I think God set it up, which is why I articulated this on Christian Nationalism's website, a defense of Brexit from this perspective, that God ordained nations to go their own ways and do their own things, from the Tower of Babel, and as Yoram Hazony puts it in his book, The Virtues of Nationalism. He's a Jewish scholar. He puts it like this: you're either a nationalist or you're imperialist. And actually, the Nazis were imperialists because they wanted to expand their empire to control other nations, whereas the Allies were nationalists because they wanted to give back the nations control of their own destinies. So the Allies were nationalists in that sense, and the Nazis were imperialists, really, in the sense of wanting to take over and stuff. And the same could be true, you could say, of the European Union. It's an imperialist project. It wants to control more and more nations, and let's control of the nations.
Let's go to some questions. I think I had James, who is a regular troll of mine, try to get into the studio, but I decided to kick him because it's just not worth engaging. However, we've got some questions, and people that are good faith actors and good faith interlocutors are more than welcome to come into the studio. The link is in the chat for you to talk about. So the term Christo-fascist is being bandied about, and I think it is just a slur. This is my take on it. Is it is just a slur designed to try and silence Christians from articulating their own desires politically, economically, socially, and culturally according to their own Christian faith. It was I forget who coined it. But it's a pretty recent term, and it is it's just a slur to try and shut down debate and discussion, on of Christians thinking politically about politics. What's your thought on the term Christian fascism or Christo-fascist?
Well, it's obviously just an insult. I agree. We're not trying to. Well, we're not trying to impose something that people don't want. We're trying to persuade people this is what's best for the nation. That's the thing. Now, all laws do impose, right? The fact is that laws against stealing impose penalties on those that steal. So laws are going to impose something. That's true, but we want the people to agree that we do want laws on stealing, for example, or laws on the right laws on marriage or whatever it might be. And that the people decide to vote for those laws, and then they get imposed by the nation. So it's not about taking over and trying to impose on people who don't want to.
It is interesting. It is interesting that you mentioned you mentioned stealing, and as our societies become more progressive, and as America's become more progressive, they have become more lenient on theft. There's a massive epidemic on stealing at the moment in our culture, and we're getting to the point where we're just shrugging our shoulders and going, "Oh well, it happens." And in America, they've even passed laws that said if you don't steal over a certain amount, you're not going to be prosecuted. So as we've moved away from Christianity, even stealing is becoming normalized.
Yeah, no, it's a serious problem, and it means that the whole cost of society for everyone goes up, because the cost of shops employing security people or finding ways of imposing security on things and so on just adds to the cost of everybody going to a shop, and it just it's bad for everyone in society, stealing. So that's a problem.
Here's a comment. Here's a question that's battered in our direction. Just comment on it. If we want a Christian nation, we will need a new defender of the faith first.
Will we
need? Your comments.
I don't think a Christian nation depends on having a Christian king. Neither of us use that in our definitions. We said a nation that is trying to follow God's ways, or deliberately trying to identify as Christian, or trying to create a Christian culture, that kind of thing. So no, I don't think it requires having a new king in that sort of sense. No.
I totally agree. I am personally open to the idea of replacing our current royal family with a different royal family. However, we don't need a Christian defender of the faith in the monarch, because it is the responsibility of all Christians to defend the faith.
Yeah,
that's not just the responsibility of the monarch. That's the responsibility of all of us. And if we're all doing it, then we don't need just a king to do it. Though I would, in a constitutional arrangement that's more monarchist, empower a Christian king to have a Christian veto according to his own conscience on anything that's not a manifesto pledge.
I'd be worried about that. What if his conscience goes wrong?
You what?
What if his conscience goes wrong? Don't like that.
Well, I mean, then we wait for a better king, but he could only veto things.
Too much power in one person, Bob. Don't like it.
Like how like Labour's passed a whole bunch of laws that were never in the manifesto.
Yeah.
I would empower the king to strike down those laws, but I wouldn't allow the king to strike down anything that is a manifesto pledge.
That's a kind of different. There's an element of something constitutional that could work.
Because I completely disagree with parties and governments passing laws that they never put to the vote, especially big ones like abortion till the end of term, or the euthanasia bill.
Yeah.
Okay, next question. Can you shed light to why the left are focusing on the Green Party, like many Muslims, or what? I don't know why they mentioned that. Why the Green Party? What's so special about it? So why this sudden move to the Green Party? Your comments.
So I think that the Green Party has become the party of sort of ultra woke, really. And whereas it used to be the party of the environment is the most important thing. The environment is our God, to put it that way. And so we want to do whatever we can do to benefit the environment, or to look after the environment, or whatever. And that's the highest value. So, it's now become kind of the wokeness is our God, and, anti-borders, and everything is equal, and all religions are equal, and all this kind of stuff. And that means that they're open to Muslims coming in and saying, yes, and we're equal too, and we want these things, and so on. And so it's suddenly become used as a tool by Islamist people to be a pro-Gaza party, which is very long way from being a pro-Green party, but there we are. I think that's how it's happened. What do you think?
I think that as everyone has become disillusioned with the uni-party of the Conservatives and Labour, that they've ended up looking for alternatives. And so it's a bit of the Jeremy Corbyn effect, that as the Corbynites kind of...
Well, that's a whole other thing, but the question about why the Muslims have gone to the Greens is kind of...
I'm answering the question. This is my answer, because the question wasn't about why the Muslims went to the Green Party. That wasn't the question. The question is why this emphasis on the Greens. And I think that the Corbynites, this is my live stream, Tim. The Corbynites were disillusioned by their loss of control of the Labour Party. They're flooding into the Greens. The Islamists see an open door within the Greens because Zach Polanski's a complete political ignoramus. And you've got this this sort of a combination of disillusionment with the uni party, the radicalization of the left and the Islamists, just combined with a gross ignorance, really. Of matters like Palestine. Palestine has definitely been a rallying call of the progressives. Gone are the days when the Greens cared about the environment, and were concerned about the AMOC disappearing, or the ozone aerosol disappearing, or the fact that global warming is doubling in speed. Hey, let's stop talking about that. Let's talk about Palestine. That's a different topic. Right, next one. Sorry if you said this earlier, but what scriptures can I use to show my lefty church friends that God likes borders and we should protect them? Well, I would say Acts 17:26 infers borders. Joshua's chapters 13 to 19 is very clear about borders. Revelations 21 verses 12 to 14, Numbers 20 verses 16 to 21. Those would be the ones that I got, and I got them all from you, Tim. So which ones would you use? Because I just
I did do this written debate with Christian Dyer.
Yeah, that's where I got it from.
In Evangelicals Now. So if you just Google Tim Dieppe, Christian Dyer, immigration, you may have to just register your email. You shouldn't have to pay to read that article. And I go through those very scriptures, but also, well, perhaps the Numbers one was the one that you're mentioning there, where the Israelites request permission to go through another nation's territory, and the nation says no, and Israel respects that and goes round the borders of the territory rather than going in the territory. And so there are quite a few scriptures like that, as well as the sort of logical principle of what's the point of having borders if you don't control who, to some extent, who comes in, who doesn't come in, and what comes in and what doesn't come in. I think the whole point of having borders is that you must limit to some degree who comes in, who doesn't come in. The question is what the limit should be. Because no nation is just going to let everyone in the world come into them, because that's suicide for a nation, but that's the kind of suicidal game, as Douglas Murray's book is called, isn't it? The suicide of the what's it called? The death of Europe, strange suicide,
the slow death of Europe, or the quiet death of Europe.
Yeah,
I would just quibble on this.
Strange death of Europe.
I would just quibble on the way that the question's phrased. I wouldn't say that God loves borders. I would just say that borders are a part of the natural law of man's heart, is to create borders.
Well, they're part of the fallen world. They're part of the fallen world.
Hold on, Tim. I haven't finished. It's not that it's my live stream. What are you doing? It's not that God loves borders. It's part of the man's natural heart to create borders, which means that it's part of our human nature to have them. What makes them good or bad is how we use them. But often in a fallen world, we use them in a negative way. But there is a redeemed way to use borders that is for the common good, rather than for some xenophobic hatred or paranoia, or, there's negative ways to use borders and there's good ways to use borders, like protecting your people. So that would be my thought of that. Go on. Also, you were eager to jump in.
Yes, obviously. Yeah, always, Bob. So listen, I would go back to why do we have nations in the first place? And we have nations in the first place because humans were conspiring to rebel against God, and as a whole, as a whole entity. And so God said, not having this, I'm going to split them up. You're now going to have different nations, and that limits the capability of totalitarianism, of rebelling against God, of rebellion, of fascism, whatever. It's limited to nations, and they can only do it within those particular borders, be as bad as they want. So yes, God set up nations with borders to control the limits of human evil and human depravity and human ability to be tyrannous. And sadly, we will one day have international government again under the reign of the Antichrist, and that's again will be rebelling against God. But borders enable nations to do their own thing and turn back to God and repent and be forgiven, or turn to God for the first time and repent and turn to Christ and recover their own sense of justice and righteousness and honesty and be blessed again, or turn away from God and be cursed and all of that kind of thing. So, and then you have, and part of the purpose as well is so people can flee from tyranny and go into other nations. This is the whole purpose originally of asylum, which is being abused in our nation at the moment. Because God set it up so that people could flee from one nation to another, as indeed Jesus did at one point in his childhood. So this is all part of the theology of nations that we need to sort of recover as well, to understand what nations are for and why we have nations and therefore why we have borders.
So we've got a question here about at what point does Scripture permit Christians to use defensive force to protect ourselves, our families, and our communities when peaceful coexistence is no longer possible? Obviously, you don't have to look far in the world to realize incidents like that, like in Nigeria or in Sudan, where Christians, peaceful coexistence are broken down in those countries. So scripturally, how would you answer that question? When, or if at all, when do you believe Christians can use force to defend themselves?
It's very interesting, isn't it, Bob? Because American Christians will answer this differently to most British Christians, right? Because Americans will say we have the right to bear arms, and we should have the right to bear arms, and we should have the right to self-defense and all of that kind of thing. And whereas British Christians will tend to say, hang on a minute, no, it's better that we don't have guns all over society, because then we don't have all these mass shootings and crazy things like that, and we don't have so much murder and such a high murder rate and all that kind of thing. So in principle, right, the biblical law says if someone is trying to attack you, you have the right to self-defense. That's the biblical law. You can defend yourself, and if in defending yourself you accidentally end up killing someone or harming someone, if they were trespassing on your property and they were intending to harm you, then that's a justification for this. And that's
should add though that that's not legal advice.
Pardon?
We're just adding that is not legal advice. The biblical principles don't necessarily matter.
No, but it's kind of that is the just approach that the Bible applies to this. That would be fair if it happened. And we've gone into a crazy system where people are getting punished for preventing robberies or preventing their wife from getting harmed, or stopping someone who was trying to attack somebody, or throwing someone off a train who was taking his clothes off, whatever, and stuff like this. Well, actually, no, that's what people should do. They should act in self-defense. They should be protected from doing that rather than punished for doing it. So, and then you have security guards in shops and in tube stations who are afraid to touch anybody or stop anybody from doing anything, because they've been told if you do, you'll probably get prosecuted and you'll probably lose. Well, it shouldn't be like that. They should have the right to stop the thief and arrest them and apprehend them. And
I think we need a government that empowers good people for doing good. It doesn't take a great brain to realize that if someone's stripping naked in front of little children, that you remove them from the train. That person shouldn't be criminalized. They should be rewarded by a society for standing up for the good.
Yes.
Or if someone's stopping a thief, they're doing a good for society, so they should be rewarded by society, not punished.
Yes.
But unfortunately, again, because of liberalism and because of the progressive liberal state, We
Yes.
actually live in a world in which it's the opposite, in which you're likely to be
It's an
prosecuted.
over application of rights and entitlement. So we think the thing has rights.
So, just hear our words as
absurd, and we think.
Just hear our words as how it should be, not what we're telling you to do. It's very clear that I put that caveat into this. Okay, next comment. I am a racist nationalist.
Am I? Am I
a racist? Sorry, that's a very good point. I needed to get that am I bit in. Apologies. That was my dyslexic brain just flipping the words around. Sorry, Rose. Let's do that again. Am I a racist nationalist if I sit in church annoyed because my church is too busy serving the international Christians from India and Poland rather than helping the local English communities? So I would ask you to consider, in answer to this, who is our first duty to? It says in Ephesians that we should do good to all men, but especially those in the house of faith. And so if a church is prioritizing Christians who are from India and Poland over, say, agnostics or atheists who happen to be English, they're actually doing what the scriptures teach. If, however, they are ignoring, the plight of English Christians to serve Christians on the other side of India and the other side of Poland, then that would be a misapplication of scripture. And so a way to think about this is what Augustine called I'm probably going to get the Latin wrong. Order amos amore. And it's this idea that you love yourself, you love God, you love the Christians in your family and in your local community, the Christians in your nation, and then the non-Christians in each of those circles, and then the Christians in the rest of the world, and then everyone else in the rest of the world. Because by serving the church, we serve Christ. By loving and serving one another, we keep the commandment of Christ. We should obviously seek to help everybody, but that's not always practical. And so where you've got limited resources and you have to make choices, then you start within the house of faith first and work your way outwards. So I don't know the full situation of what you're saying, because I don't know if they're sending money abroad and not helping the local Christian community. But certainly if they've got money to send abroad, and then it means that they have money to work in their local community first. And so long as they're looking after the local Christian community first, their next order of priority should be to look after the other local people to that. That would be my understanding of Ephesians and the Order Amos Amore. What would be yours, Tim? Or would you come at it from a different angle?
No, I'm with you on that. I might slightly disagree on, I think family takes priority even if they're not Christians yet, or some of them, over other people. But generally, I agree with you broadly. Yes, that the priority is Christians and so on. Yeah.
To answer the question about the racism, I would ask you this, Rose, because obviously I don't know you, sister, so you just got to figure this out for yourself. Are you just angry that Indians and Polish people are being helped because they're Indian and Polish rather than English? I would say that if that is your reasoning, if that is where your heart is, then you need to do some work on that as a Christian. Because you shouldn't be angry just because someone's getting helped because they're Indian or because they're Polish. But obviously you know yourself better than I do, and I'm certainly not trying to characterize your position. Okay, let's move on to another question. Let's have a look. If you've got any questions, you need to put at Bob. Obviously, the people that were just rambling on, throwing out constant insults, I've kicked them out of the chat because, if all you're going to do is just shoot names at me, rather than ask sensible questions or make sensible comments, I don't need to engage with you. Bob, Speaker's Corner, how to join the Christian Nationalist Fellowship? Please share a link. Thank you. Well, it's not up to me. I'm not the one that organizes it, so I can't really tell you. I think at some point in the future, the Christian Nationalist Fellowship will expand itself to a broader scope, but that hasn't been decided yet. The Christian Nationalist Fellowship of the UK is a pretty new organization, and we're right at the very beginning of figuring out what we're about and what we're trying to achieve. And so one of the paths that we might go down is to expand out the fellowship to everyone, or not. I don't know. It's a group decision, and I'm not in charge. So is there anything you want to add on to that, Tim?
Nope. Yeah. We're at the exploratory stage, trying to work out what it means and how the extent to which we agree, and what definitions are and all this kind of stuff. So, yeah.
And there's emerging schools of thought within our own group. Professor
disagreement between me and you, Bob. Yeah,
exactly. 2 different schools of thought right here on the page. I agree with Professor Yuffle. You are an incredibly brave man to interrupt me, Tim. Especially on my live stream. It's only because I love you that you don't know what you're doing.
It's okay.
Right, let's move on. Any other comments? Again, if you want to come in and chat to us directly, you're probably out of time, to be honest. Yeah, you've only got 5 minutes. All right. So again, just people throwing out insults who don't. I'll address this comment directly. No, it's not true that I just call people who disagree with me with a troll, because as you've just seen, Tim has admitted that he dares to disagree with me on my live stream, and not once have I called him a troll. So this is utterly false. It is just people that, like you, Paul, just throw out insults. Those are the people that get kicked out. If all you're going to do is ramble in my chat and throw out insults and slander, and obviously I'm not going to engage with you. And notice, Paul, I haven't kicked you out and I haven't called you a troll. So in your face, bro. Anyway, moving on. Okay, it looks like no one else has got any more questions for us. So this is probably going to be a good place to stop. Can I find one more? Nope, that's it. We're done. Right. In that case, I'll just read a psalm and then we'll bring this to a close. Tim, I just got to say, it's been a pleasure.
It has been a pleasure. I really enjoyed it, Bob.
Yeah, your comments were really insightful. And I just want to say again, to Danny, you've got a right to reply. Anyone that I talk about on this channel in this way has a right to reply. So do feel free to come in to arrange to talk to me alone or me and Tim if you want to. And we'll set something up that is comfortable for you. And we'll have a chat and discuss things. Okay, I'm going to read Psalm 122. I was glad when they said unto me, let us go into the house of the Lord. Our feet shall stand within your gates, O Jerusalem. Jerusalem is built as a city that is compact together, where the tribes go up, the tribes of Yahweh, unto the testimony of Israel, to give thanks unto the name of Yahweh. For there are set thrones of judgment, the thrones of the house of David. Pray for the peace of Jerusalem. They shall prosper that love you. Peace be within your walls, and prosperity within your palaces. For my brethren and companions' sake, I will now say, peace be within you. Because of the house of Yahweh our God, I will seek your good. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Amen. I'll speak to you after I close the live stream, Tim.